Imagine a world embroiled in fantastical anomalies beyond the scope of realism. From dragons to the undead lurking in ancient catacombs waiting for their next victim, there are plenty of interesting things to discover in this world the player has been thrust into. The first major choice the player can make is to decide what mythical creature they want to play as for the rest of the game. Only after being informed, the player is minutes away from their ultimate demise. From there, a deus ex machina interrupts the player execution, only adding further to how this story starts in media res. The second major choice the player can make is to side with the Imperials or Stormcloaks before entering the first dungeon. Upon exiting the dungeon, the player character is free to go in any direction they want, although this element of freedom and seemingly limitless wonder has seemed to dissipate since Skyrim released and every subsequent entry in the Bethesda backlog. Furthermore, the game almost encourages the player to get distracted by its atmosphere and other things within the world itself. With so many locations to explore, the player in theory does not have to even do more than a single quest in full if they only care about exploration. From the Viking and Celtic influence of real life to the mythical fantasy land, there are plenty of atmospheric additions to take in. For example, bar fights and werewolf transformations happen in the same town every night. However, the quests may appeal more to those seeking a sense of adventure, from side quests that can result in you meeting a mad god for dinner, to faction quests that can decide the outcome of the civil war within Skyrim. Venturing forth into the unknown has an equally rewarding result. The player will come across several towns and kingdoms during their adventure with NPCs that have everyday tasks and lives to live, from acquiring maidens at the Temple of Mara to helping the Forsworn escape Markarth. There are plenty of interesting things to discover about the NPCs of Skyrim despite their general clunkiness. Speaking of clunkiness, NPC AI in video games is not always the greatest in the world, and Skyrim is no exception to that theory. The vendor bucket trick that allows the player to steal as many items as they desire is a prime example of this. Not only that, but the player can also command a follower to pick up items beyond maximum carrying capacity, making them the perfect pack mule. Despite these problems, none of them have been fixed in the decades since the game initially launched. Normally I would not complain about glitches like that, but the game has been re-released multiple times without any bug fixes and sometimes adding new bugs in the process, so I have every right to complain about an unfinished product. Not only that, but these have broken pre-existing mods often and even left them permanently inaccessible without an older version of the game in some circumstances. There was a seemingly easy fix to circumvent any problem like that ever occurring. Take for example Dust, where upon launching the game you can choose to go to the DLC or the main game from Steam. Likewise, something like that could have worked to have different versions of Skyrim upon booting up the game from Steam. Regardless of these nitpicks, there is a group of people that benefits the most from these new updates, namely console players. Before Skyrim's Special Edition, they would have to rely on YouTube to see any sort of external modifications to the game, but upon its release came the Creation Club and the paid mods that ensued with it. Unlike regular mods, the creations of these were heavily restricted by Bethesda guidelines, and this led to less than desirable results when making quest lines because no new dialogue could be added to the game per the rules. However, it was very good for console players looking for more expansive mods that they could not otherwise obtain. This would not satisfy PC players, so as a last-ditch effort to sell these mods to the players, Bethesda made Skyrim Anniversary Edition, with all Creation Club DLC included, and now with the new update that once again broke mods for PC players, the new and improved Creations is basically paid mods without the prior restrictions of Creation Club, making them seem really pointless in retrospect. With all these negatives that have been coming out of Bethesda recently, players have begun to lose hope for the next entry in the series that turned them into the money-hungry, soulless corporation they are today. Skyrim players like me experienced this first with Fallout 4 with a lackluster main story, and then with Tess Blades and Elder Scrolls Online, where it is extremely apparent that Bethesda cares more about making the player pay to win their games than letting them do so without restrictions naturally. The cycle has just repeated itself with Starfield, and unfortunately I believe the same thing may happen with Elder Scrolls 6 if no major change happens at Bethesda from now until its release. However, that is not to say it cannot happen. Morrowind is a prime example of how Bethesda did exactly that. For misses in the 90s like Battlespire and Redguard, Bethesda desperately needed a hit to avoid bankruptcy. This is where Morrowind came into play, fundamentally changing the way main series games function for the better, or worse, depending on what type of playstyle appeals to your liking. That is, Elder Scrolls 1 Arena and Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall were very different from Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Fans of these games were probably expecting a dungeon crawler life simulator more than a dense world with a smaller scale when Morrowind came out, because that is exactly what they were. Furthermore, these older games utilize procedural generation, while the newer games like Morrowind were much more handcrafted than prior main series entries. However, over time, the handcrafted worlds became what Bethesda was most known for, not the procedurally generated life simulators they had made before. Despite this, Bethesda seems to have been utilizing procedural generation more and more with each new entry in their catalog of main series games, making them more hated by the fan base of the games that utilize less of it. Take for example, the difference in how much procedurally generated quest lines were utilized in Skyrim versus Fallout 4. In Skyrim, they were optional miscellaneous quests, and in Fallout 4, they became the primary part of the main story. With the release of Starfield, it is ever more prevalent that the general gaming audience does not want those types of quest lines. It is almost as if the lack of handcrafted worlds in favor of a larger scope and scale has completely flipped what type of audience Bethesda wants to appeal to yet again, except this time at the detriment of the wider gaming audience instead of the niche community of gamers that existed when Daggerfall and Arena came out. This can be fixed, however it may be at the detriment of review scores, so I doubt it will happen. Take for example Fallout New Vegas, a game that did poorly among actual critics, costing them the deal that they made with Bethesda prior to its release about its critic scores by a single point. Despite this, fan reception of the game has been growing ever more positive to this day due to the meaningful choices, questlines, and writing that heavily affected the outcome of the story. Arguably, this is what Bethesda has been lacking from their games since even before Skyrim. However, regardless of when this started, Bethesda has gradually lost sight of what their fanbase desires in favor of a seemingly lukewarm approach to storytelling and overall gameplay in general. And now, that very same feeling of wonder and limitless freedom has turned to the hopelessness of a vagabond wandering aimlessly in fear of finding nothing at their next destination. And with the release of the Starfield Shattered Space trailer, not much has seemed to change. If anything, they're trying to use the emptiness of space to add in less content to the game. Although I'm not opposed to new stories or new IPs, the way Bethesda has went about it was a mistake. Hyping fans up about Elder Scrolls at the same time as Starfield, like it would release alongside it, was a desperate attempt to save face, and has only soured fans' opinions of Bethesda as time has went on, myself included.